if you have to ask that question, there's probably some unhealthy things that are in that environment that need to be checked. All right, welcome to the Church Dropout podcast. My name is Alan. I'm the host. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am writing solo Church Dropout as a podcast. We talk about issues, topics, and teachings related to faith, life, and culture in ways that are sometimes funny, sometimes serious, but always insightful. If you have not already, please like, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast at. I came across something online today that I thought was interesting that I wanted to share some thoughts on, maybe raise some questions about, and hear your thoughts on. I was just perusing online and somebody put a post and asked the community a question, and I want to dialogue a little bit about it. And so the question that was asked is this. They put, serious question. When do you think it would be appropriate, righteous, sanctifying, or edifying to correct your pastor? Again, when do you think it would be appropriate, righteous, sanctifying, or edifying to correct your pastor? And I thought this was a very interesting question to put out in the community, to put out online, right? And I think it says a lot about church culture, and how in a lot of aspects it's toxic, right? Especially in how we relate to leadership, and not only on how the church views leadership, but how leadership views themselves. For most communities, I could tell you from experience that pastors sit outside of the community. Most pastors don't see themselves as a part of the community. And most people don't want their pastors, to be honest with you, to be inside of the community. And by that, what I mean is that so many look at the pastor as an example of righteousness, right? They see the pastor as being perfect, or the leader within that community being perfect. And, and if you expose too much sin as a pastor, it makes people, uncomfortable. But on the other side of that, pastors often see themselves as sitting outside of the community. And especially in toxic cultures where leadership is built up in a very specific way, where the leadership team or the lead pastor is unapproachable, especially in a toxic community, this is when your community is toxic, is when there's sort of a different accountability structure for the leadership or for the pastor. And so I thought this was a very interesting question. Now, this person says that they've been a part of this community for a long time. This is not the first time something has come up. They want to approach them, but they're asking this question on how should they approach them, if they should approach them, how should they go about doing this? And just a couple things here before I get into, I guess how we should approach our pastor and why we should approach our pastor. Part of my response to this was, you're probably, in a toxic culture if you have to ask this question. There's probably some unhealthiness that's happening within that culture if you need to ask how to approach your pastor, right? If you're worried about getting it right, and you are worried about how that might be perceived, then there's probably some unhealthiness that's driving that culture. And unfortunately, again, this is something that's all too common in church culture today, where, people feel like they can't approach leadership with questions or with rebuke, where the leader sits on a pedestal and can only accept feedback from other pastors or people who are like them. I actually knew a pastor who, I actually knew a pastor who, his elders couldn't even keep him accountable. He had to kind of create an elder board outside of the elder board community of pastors who lead communities like he leads communities to keep him accountable. And I was like, no, that's crazy. That's not right. We don't need a governing board. If you're serving the body, then the body should be able to have access to you and help hold you accountable, right? Because they're the ones who are supposed to be able to see into your life. But this can go all sorts of ways, right? Because when we start talking about the mega church, we start talking about when you have thousands of members and stuff like that, it's difficult for stuff like this to happen. Now, I don't know the size of this church, but it's difficult for you to be able to approach the pastor to ask questions or to speak into their lives in a certain way, because there's not a real relationship, right? There's not a real relationship there. You have a relationship with the person who's just sharing a message with you each week, but there's no life on life transfer. So that can get difficult. But anyway, the fact that this person needs to ask this question, I would be concerned that they're asking, how do I approach my pastor? Just think about that. Just think about how that sounds. How do I approach my pastor? How is he pastoring you if you're unable to approach him? How is he pastoring you if you have concerns, if you can or can't approach him with what you want to approach him with? But yet you're still saying my pastor. That's a very personal thing. If I'm calling someone my pastor, again, it's very specific to what they do. It's not an office or a title, so to speak, as much as it describes what a leader does within that community. They lead, guide, shepherd the community, love the sheep, protect the sheep, feed the sheep, all types of stuff that a shepherd would do. The word pastor really just describes the work a shepherd does, right? And if you're saying that's my pastor, I'm looking at that entailing all of those things that should be happening. And if you are concerned with how you're going to approach him, then he's probably not pastoring you. He's probably a teacher who's teaching the Bible on Sunday, who has the title pastor, but is not pastoring in the lives of individuals. Now, again, maybe that's a separate subject. But if you have to ask this question, that's a problem. But I will say this: how do you approach, a pastor if they are doing something that you feel is wrong? How do you approach them? How do you approach them? You approach them like you would approach any other Christian who's struggling or in sin. And I would say, first, pastors are people. They're people. They're not any more special than anybody else in the congregation. They have a different role within the congregation, but they're no different than anybody else in the congregation when it comes to the relationship between believers, right? I think, again, because in Christianity today, we see everything sort of as a hierarchy where the pastor kind of sits at the top and everybody serves the pastor. I want you to think about what Jesus told his disciples, when he washed their feet, and he tells them, listen, here your masters become your servant in terms of I'm washing your feet, right? Normally that would be something that the servants would do for the master. And Jesus is saying, no, I'm doing this to you. The master is washing the feet of the servant. And he said, this is how you ought to live. And then even Peter talks about lording over the congregation and, all of that stuff. So there's warnings there for pastors to do that. And the church really should be set up more of an upside down triangle, right? Where the leaders are holding the church up versus them being served at the top of the pyramid. And we'll do a video on that, or I'll do a video on that at some point, just talking about leadership in the church and how that's changed as well. But you approach them the same way you would approach your brother and sister if they're caught up in sin, right? You do it with gentleness, and you do it with a humble attitude, and you do it in a very loving way. You do it respectfully, but you'd approach them the same way, right? Assuming you have the ability to do that, assuming that you have the relationship to be able to do that. And again, I don't know what type of community this is. If it's a large church community, then good luck. I mean, how do you even get to the pastor to be able to do that? You probably got to write it down, send an email. You got to do some stuff, and there's no guarantee that that information even gets there or that conversation happens. But if you have the opportunity to approach your pastor, you approach them lovingly in relationship, and you do it in a way in a way that honors Scripture and that honors God and that honors them as your pastor. And we look at Galatians, where the writer says that we ought to bear one another's burdens, right? And we ought to restore one another gently, right? Lest you be tempted and fall into sin. So you do it with the attitude of love and of concern and of patience, prayerfully entering into that conversation, with your leader, because I'm assuming that you love them. And so we don't approach pastors differently than we approach anyone else. I think that actually, keeps this idea that pastors are different than everybody else going. And I know we live in a culture now where pastors are somewhat celebrities. It just happens that way. And then traditionally, pastors are usually treated differently because of their title, or seen as more important in the body because of their titles. But the reality is that pastors are no different than the body. They serve a different purpose. They serve a different role. If there is something that a pastor is caught up in, then we approach them as a brother or a sister in Christ. We approach them in a loving, gentle attitude, full of humility, prayerfully addressing the situation that needs to be addressed. We don't need to do anything, special, in that. However, I will say this, like I said before, the fact that you have to ask this question, the fact that a person would have to ask this question, if you have to ask this question about your pastor, one, they're probably not pastoring you, because you would know relationally how to address that. And two, if you have to ask that question, there's probably some unhealthy things that are in that environment that need to be checked. There's probably some things that are going wrong or are wrong within that community that's causing, this angst to be able to address this situation. So that's it. That's all I have. I'd love to hear what you think. So please drop a comment below. Thank you so much for tuning into the Church Dropout podcast. I will talk to you soon. Please like, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. God bless you.